Once again, thank you for your testimony. It's been stated many times that the United States maintains its ability to impose sanctions relative to support of terrorism, human rights violations, and ballistic missile issues. And I've read the JCPOA, and there are several paragraphs in the JCPOA that give me concern. Let me just read one, and that's paragraph 29, where the parties will refrain from any policy specifically intended to directly or adversely affect normalization of trade and economic relations with Iran. So, Secretary Lew, I just want to get your assurance that we have full ability to use the tools of sanctions against Iran for its support of terrorism, human rights, and ballistic, non-nuclear type of activities, which include congressional action that Congress might want to take.
Senator Cardin, it was a matter of extensive discussion in the negotiations. We made clear in the negotiations that we retained the ability and we were going to keep in place sanctions on terrorism, on regional destabilization, on human rights violations. In fact, we are not lifting sanctions that are based on those authorities, and we're not de-designating entities that were designated for those reasons. We also have made clear we reserve the right to put additional sanctions in place to address concerns about terrorism, human rights.
And when you say we, it includes the Congress of the United States.
So, Congress has authorities in this area. I know that there's currently legislation pending regarding Hezbollah, and we would work with you on legislation. The thing that we can't do is we can't just put right back in place everything that was part of the nuclear sanctions and just put a new label on it. We have reserved our rights to put sanctions in place that address those continuing malign activities.
The Iran Sanctions Act expires at the end of 2016. We will still be in the JCPOA period of time where snapback of sanctions is a viable hedge against Iran's cheating. Congress may well want to extend that law so that that power is available immediately if Iran were to violate the agreement. Is that permitted under the JCPOA?
I think that if it's on expiration, it's one thing. If it's well in advance, it's another. I think the idea of coming out of the box right now is very different from what you do when it expires.
Let me ask us, Secretary, the question is, why would that be? It's either allowed or not allowed, but we'll get to that. I want to get to Secretary Moniz, if I might. The 24 days that you referred to, and I appreciate your explanation, but there are three types of activities that could take place in violation of the JCPOA by Iran. They could be directly using nuclear material that is in violation, and you've already addressed that issue as far as the 24 days. But it could involve weaponization, or it could involve research not using nuclear material. Would the 24-day delay in those cases compromise our ability to determine whether Iran is in compliance with the agreement?
Senator Cardin, again, let's put the nuclear material, I think we've addressed and is quite secure. Clearly, when it goes into weaponization activities, even there's a spectrum. For example, working with uranium metal is something that would still involve nuclear material, and I think we would have very, very strong tools there. When we go to some other activities, without getting into too many specifics, there will still be a variety of signatures. For example, my second priority on the weaponization list would be explosively driven neutron sources, and I think that there are certainly telltale signs that I think we would have access to, or the IAEA inspectors more precisely would have access to. Clearly, as one gets into other areas such as computer modeling, that's a very different kind of detection challenge. And in all of these cases, to go to undeclared sites, we are going to rely upon our intelligence capabilities, those of our partners, to be able to point the IAEA to suspicious activities. But there are non-nuclear signatures, but it does get more complicated.
Thank you. Secretary Kerry, I want you to elaborate a little bit more on our capacity after the time limits in Iran's obligations after the time limits on its nuclear enrichment towards a weaponization of a nuclear weapon. I understand they still have obligations under their non-proliferation treaty. They still have obligations with the additional protocols under the NPT. But could you tell us how much lead time we will have, what a breakout looks like after the 15 years, and what assurances do we have that we will be able to detect and take action before Iran becomes a nuclear weapon state after the 15 years?
Well, first of all, Senator, throughout the entire life of the agreement, the additional protocol provides for the right of access. That is where the 24-hour notice for access comes from, and they have to respond to it. So if we had any intelligence regarding a suspicious activity or suspicious site, shared, I might add, among many, among all the P5+1, Israel, countries in the region, we will have an incredible amount of sourcing for this. We would then be able to put the ask to them, and they have to respond to that. And if they don't respond to that, then we have the ability to convene, to vote, to put back in place sanctions, or to take other actions if we deem that appropriate. But
after the 15 years?
Yes, but let me just fill out for you. We also have a 20-year component which allows us televised tracking of their centrifuge production of their rotors and bellows on the centrifuges. And we have a 25-year, quite remarkable insight, which is a access and monitoring tracking of their life of the uranium cycle. So from the mining, the mills, the yellow cake production, the gasification, the centrifuge, out into the waste, we will have an ability, the IAEA will have the ability to appropriately monitor that every step of the way. So if we have X amount of raw uranium ore coming out or in the mill, if there's X amount of milling taking place and then some is diverted somewhere, or we don't see it going into the place it next has to go to, we're going to have extraordinary insight to this. In addition to that, under the additional protocol and under the IAEA process for civil nuclear programs, all of the facilities are declared because it is a civil nuclear program. As such, there's literally 24/7 visitation in those sites. They're not even request sort of situations. It's only for the undeclared facility about which you have a suspicion that you have to go through the other process. But we're going to have amazing insight because they are living by the NPT, or allegedly they're going to live by the NPT, and that's what we have to make sure they are doing. And so we have day-to-day insight to that. I might add to all our colleagues that under the interim agreement, which, by the way, a number of people called an historic mistake and a tragedy, and you heard all of the same rhetoric you're hearing now, those same people asked for us to keep that in place 2 years later because it's worked. And the fact is, Iran has lived up to every component of that over the course of the last years. They reduced the 20% uranium, they undid Iraq, and so on and so forth. I won't go through it all now. So we will have this level of insight, which I think is not being examined enough and understood enough. It's not nothing ends at 15 years. Simply the size of the stockpile limitation ends, and the enrichment, they can enrich further, but we will have insight to that enrichment. A civil nuclear program requires enrichment at approximately 5% or so. I mean, that's the high end of it. If you start to enrich higher, up around the 20%, you're talking about the Tehran research reactor or a few other things. But there's no rationale whatsoever for enrichment above that. And we would have insight to that enrichment program that would instantly know if they're beginning to go somewhere else. Red flags go off everywhere, and we'd be all over it and able to respond. We'd actually have months to respond, to be honest with you. And so the fact is the breakout team never goes down to a level below which we have an ability to be able to respond. And I think Ernie can speak to the full breadth of this scrutiny.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.